This meeting is being recorded.
Just so everybody knows. All right. So tonight's topic is being right versus being happy. Okay. And so when we think about trying to be right versus happy, my students will always say to me, well, why can't I be both? Why can't I be right and happy? And I suppose there are moments that works. But for our purposes, we're going to talk about the need to be right. So one of the ideas behind being right is the need to defend something. So when we need to be right, what is it that we're defending? Any idea what it is that we're defending?
Our ego.
Certainly our ego, absolutely. Our ego, and of course, in our vernacular, ego is sort of equivalent to matrix thinking, right?
Your identity.
Yeah, our ego, the matrix thinking. I like that, Neville, identity. We're defending our identity, which in our vernacular is the false belief that we have about ourselves, right?
Right.
So it would seem as if I have an I'm not lovable belief, my desire to be right would be defending against that, but in reality, we're defending for that belief. Because when I have to convince someone outside of me or some other being that I'm right in order to be lovable, I've just become outer directed. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, and I'm going to say that again, when I have an I'm not lovable belief, I'm not worthy belief, I'm not good enough belief, whatever it is, it would appear when I get defensive that I'm defending against that belief, but actually I'm reinforcing the reality of the belief, because when I defend against what the other person is saying, I'm saying that their comments are an indication of who I am. Does that make sense to everybody? That can be a little bit confusing. So I'll say it one more time. When I have a false belief, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not valuable, I'm not lovable, whatever the false belief is, and someone makes a comment and I feel like I need to defend myself, it feels like I'm defending it looks almost like I'm defending myself against the belief, but I'm actually advocating for the reality of it. And this goes back to, if somebody calls you a yellow Volkswagen, there's no energy for you around that. Somebody calls you a yellow Volkswagen, it's like, so what? I don't care. But if someone calls you an idiot or a jerk, you must have some, and you feel defensive about that, you must have some belief in the reality of that idea of that false belief. So again, when I need to defend myself, in other words, I need to be right in the eyes of this other person, I'm being outer directed. I need them to affirm that I am lovable. I need them to affirm that I am worthy. I need them to affirm that I am good enough, whatever the false belief is. And that's an outer directed situation. And again, we've talked about this, how often do people show up that way? How often do the people in our world always say the right thing, always say loving, encouraging, supportive stuff to us? Very rarely does that happen. So if we're going around trying to get other people to do that, that's a real problem, okay? So questions about that? That's sort of a deeper concept in this idea that it would appear as if I'm trying to defend myself against it, but I'm actually arguing for the reality of the false belief when I try and defend myself. That should fry some wires for you guys. Any questions about it? Any concerns about that concept? So, what do we do with that idea? And again, we'll get to happy in a minute, but as far as that goes, as far as these false beliefs go, and this process that we're talking about, ego, matrix thinking, it's an identity, it's a false belief, and needing to be right. Again, it's very outer directed concept. And so what do we do with this information? So this is fine and dandy, Chris, that you're telling me that, when I defend myself against it, I'm actually advocating for the reality of it. So what's my other option? The other, what's anybody have an idea of what's your other option? Instead of defending yourself, what can you do?
Give it no energy.
Give it no energy. There you go. Okay.
Or you can use it as information to understand what your misbelief is.
Yeah. If you're able to give it no energy, then you really don't need to defend yourself. And so that's a reasonable option. But what I'm talking about is when you have energy around and you can't seem to let go of the energy. And so what did you say, Neville?
Yeah, so look at it, use it as a marker as far as what your misbelief is.
Yeah. And so you can ask a question and get curious. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, or what's causing that?
Yeah, this person made that comment and I feel the need to defend myself. And so isn't that interesting that that's going on? Instead of trying to convince them to show up differently so that I can feel okay about myself, maybe I need to examine what's going on for me. So it really is a matter of looking back at me. And so this is the mirror, right? This is the mirror part of our life. When we're upset about something that someone said or about something that happened in our life, that's a mirror reflecting back to us some belief that we have about ourselves. Does that make sense to everybody?
Mhm.
Hey, Chris, I have a quick question.
Yes.
As far as what you can do to respond,
Yeah.
if you were to answer as a hypothetical, like acknowledge the joke and acknowledge the comment and almost turn it into a joke, sort of showing humor about it, would that be okay, or would that be bordering into like negative self-talk?
Yeah.
I think deflection.
Yeah, it sort of sounds like deflection. I guess it depends on what's going on. Like I have my students call me weird all the time, or call me, they like to call me, who's the bad guy always? Oh, Lex Luthor. They tell me I look like. And I usually just joke around about it. And so if Paul, there really is no energy around it and you're joking around about it, there's nothing wrong with that. But if there's any energy around it and you're trying to deflect or be sarcastic or put it back on the other person, so you sort of have to distinguish that. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the big thing is that's the mirror reflecting something back to me and something that I can look at. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'm going to pull up some slides. Anybody else with questions or comments about that?
You know, I want to share something that happened with me.
Yeah, sure.
I have one brother who I've been having some challenges with communicating. He called me early in the morning, and our conversation kind of degraded quickly. And finally, I told him what the situation was going on. Finally, he backed up. I said, "Okay," but in that moment, I realized, you know, I could have labeled him as being what a jerk, but just being an asshole, whatever. But I kind of just took a couple of minutes to reflect on it, and I realized, well, he's got frustration, anger. He must be feeling helpless. And I'm thinking to myself, crap, that sounds like me. I mean, that's how I was feeling. And basically, because what it was building up, the energy was building up because it was like bouncing off each other. It was like a resonance. And it was getting bigger and bigger until it finally broke. He broke it because, but I was just noticing that he's going through having the same exact experience I'm having in that moment, or similar stuff coming up, frustration, and it was showing up as a helplessness and showing up as frustration and anger.
Yeah, so you taking the time to notice how you were experiencing that shifted the experience of it.
Afterwards, because I was still kind of charged up, but took some time and thought, well, what just happened? That was, why am I having such an emotional over this? And then I realized, and then that he's going through that. I got to what was going on pretty quickly, and then I realized that's my stuff. As we're having the same experience, showing up differently because I've been feeling frustrated, angry, and helpless.
Gotcha. Sure.
And I just was kind of like the mirroring thing, I guess.
Yeah, and to contrast that, the story I frequently tell about my student who was yelling at me because he wanted to go back to school and they told him no, and he started dropping a bunch of F-bombs on me and calling me all kinds of names and literally screaming at me in my office. I got that had nothing to do with me. So I didn't get defensive. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try and make him wrong. I just got that he was projecting his pain and I let him do that. And then I dismissed him and sent him home and let him, cool off at home. But I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I didn't feel the need to be right in this moment. I didn't have to go after vengeance. I didn't have to punish him. I didn't have to write him up, any of those kind of things, because it was like he was calling me a yellow Volkswagen, whatever names he was calling me, whatever things he was calling me. I got that first of all, they weren't true for me. And I knew that what he was saying was about his emotional pain. It wasn't about me or who I am at all. So that's sort of the difference in this situation. And one of the things to keep in mind about this idea of being right is when you're in the matrix, being right is about being right in the eyes of someone else. In other words, it's about convincing somebody else that I'm not lovable or that I am lovable, or convincing someone else that I'm good enough, or convincing someone else that I'm worthy, some of those kind of things. So keep that in mind when we're talking about this version of having to be right. It's trying to convince someone else that you're okay because I don't feel okay inside. And as long as I don't feel okay inside, it doesn't matter what anybody else says to me or how they show up. I've got to deal with that. I don't feel okay inside piece. Otherwise, it's never going to change for me. This is why we go to this idea of mirroring and getting interested in what's happening and what's going on for me in this situation. So, other questions, comments, stories about that? I'm going to share my screen here. See if I can get to the right. Hopefully these slides are up. So I wanted to go through this payoffs and costs of our grievances. So this is an old section that we used to do. We now do it in the introduction piece. So people from the weekend don't see it very often, but it's very relevant to what we're talking about today. So I'm just going to go through this and discuss it with respect to being right or happy. So the first distinction we have is what a complaint is. A complaint is a need to change reality in order to be happy, a judgment that someone shouldn't be the way they are, a judgment that something shouldn't be the way it is. So I'm going to bring that up to full screen. So these are some of the distinctions that we have for a complaint. So you guys can kind of read through those. A need to change reality in order to be happy. And in my version, I'm trying to get the other person to show up differently. That's the reality that I'm trying to change so that I can be happy. If they would just be nice to me, if they would say the right thing to me, then I can be happy. And it's just never going to work that way. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever get upset about like you're somehow bad or wrong if you get upset because someone said something to you. It happens. Neville's story is a beautiful one. He was frustrated with what was going on between he and his brother. He thought about it afterwards and sort of de-escalated himself and let go of some of the steam for himself because he realized what was going on. And that's the way it usually works. Usually we get worked up when someone says something, when we get engaged with someone, and then later on we figure out like, is it really worth my being upset? And it's not. Like, and I sort of see what's really happening here. So that's our distinction for a complaint. Then we go to our distinction for a grievance, which is a fixed way of being, angry, sad, depressed, disappointed, etc. All kinds of other beliefs or ways of being this could be associated with a complaint. So I think the Browns should have won the game, and I'm very angry that they didn't. And every time I think about the way they lost that game, I get angry. That's my fixed way of being. And again, my complaint is the Browns should have won. My grievance is the anger that I have associated with that complaint. Whether it's the weather, whether it's politicians, whether it's something that happened. Sometimes it's something that happened to me a long time ago. My father should have paid me more attention. And every time I think about the lack of attention from him as a child, my complaint is he should have paid more attention to me. And the grievance I have around that is I'm depressed about the fact that my dad did not show me enough attention. And again, you guys stop me. I can't see you, so stop me if you have questions. So becoming aware, so this is where we're down to that mirroring idea. Becoming aware of your grievances and the effects they have on your life is a key to getting out of the matrix. That's why we do grievance worksheets. Okay, so we're gonna look at some of the effects. So the payoff, this is about being right. The payoff of holding on to your grievances. So in this instance with the father who didn't show me enough attention, I get to be right. See, he was wrong. I am right in this instance in that he should have showed me more attention and he didn't. So I'm right. He gets to be wrong. This is the list of payoffs for my complaints and grievances. I get to feel special. And this specialness is I was aggrieved by my father. And some people wear things like that as a badge of specialness. I was abused. I was taken advantage of. And I'm not saying that everybody who has those experiences does that, but some people use that as some sort of a badge of, and I don't want to upset anybody, but sometimes people talk about, you know, they identify as a survivor of something. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but if I identify myself as the survivor of something, I'm always associated with that something. And so I struggle with that idea. I get to feel validated. And again, in this instance, in this version with my father, I get to feel validated. And it goes along with being right, they're wrong, I feel special. I feel validated in that Of course, anybody who listens to that story says, yes, you're absolutely right, Chris. Your father should have paid more attention to you as a child. The story you're describing is absolutely horrible that he didn't show enough attention to you. So you feel validated in your version, in your complaint, in your grievance. You feel in some level of control because at least I understand the way it should have been rather than the way it was. I get attention in the sense that I hold on to this grievance and I can complain to people and people can say, oh gosh, Chris, you're absolutely right. That's awful that that happened to you. It shouldn't have happened that way. And you should be upset by that. You get to be, and these all sort of fall in line. You get some satisfaction in recognizing or identifying your father as the problem and the cause of your struggles and the cause of your depression. And it's not me. Okay, so that's the payoffs you get for hanging on to your grievances. And that looks like a pretty good list in and of itself. Being right, making someone else wrong, being special, validated, in control, getting attention, getting some satisfaction. Those all sound like reasonable things and things that someone would want. And they look like a decent list of payoffs. So let's look at the costs. I don't know about you, but when I'm holding on to a grievance, I have no peace of mind. In fact, it's impossible to hold on to a grievance and have peace. Those two things can't exist in your mind at the same time. Now we fade in and out of that. I might forget about the grievance for a while and have some level of peace of mind. But if it's always there in my subconscious, in the background, running in my background, it's going to affect my level of peace of mind. And by the way, this can also be some choice that you made in your past. In other words, like you can look at some incident that happened in your life as a child and say, if that hadn't happened, then I wouldn't be this way, or this wouldn't have happened. And that's holding on to a grievance. So you lose peace of mind, love. And again, I don't know about you, but whenever I'm in a state of grievance and I'm depressed, angry, or upset, I'm not feeling the sense of love. There's no joy in holding on to grievances. You certainly aren't happy. And here's the big question. Do you prefer that you be right or happy? And so in this instance with Dad, I'm not denying the fact that Dad not paying attention to me as a child had an effect on me as a child. And I'm not saying that I don't need to work through that. Absolutely, there's some therapeutic stuff that I can do to work through that. But one of the things that I can recognize is, I can start to get curious about, why am I still angry about this? Why am I still depressed about this? Is it serving me to be that way? And why did my dad show up that way? Was it really about me? And once you start to dig in on that, you start to recognize, no, it really wasn't about me. Now, I had an interesting discussion with my daughter today, and we were talking about the fact that sometimes you can use the philosophy that I just laid out to you, this idea that Dad didn't do it because of me. He didn't mean to hurt me. As an adult, I can choose not to be upset about that anymore. We can use that philosophy or those ideas to deny what's going on for us. In other words, if I have some deep-seated upset that I need to work on, I don't want to deny that. So I might need to dig in and look at it in a more therapeutic setting and understand what it was about, what was going on for me, and what's going on for me today that I'm holding on to that. So I don't want to deny the upset. So there are some moments in life, like the Browns lose, and I say, I'm going to allow myself to be upset for 5 minutes and move on. Perfectly reasonable strategy. But it's possible, again, that I can be denying some emotional piece of myself when I say, I'm just going to justify Dad's behavior when I was a kid by saying that he didn't know what he was doing. Does that make sense? There's sort of a fine line there, making sure that you're not in denial of what you're feeling and what's going on for you emotionally. Intimacy, again, holding on to grievances, you lose intimacy. I don't know about you, but when I'm angry at somebody, the last thing I want to do is give them a hug or have an open, friendly, loving conversation with them, which is also intimacy. Healing, and this is emotional healing, this is physical healing, this is healing in a relationship. Again, when I'm holding on to a grievance with somebody else or from a past situation, holding on to that grievance absolutely blocks healing, whether it's emotional, physical, or spiritual healing. Reality, and again, when I'm holding on to a grievance, I'm stuck in the grievance and I can't necessarily see the reality of what actually happened or what is really going on because I'm stuck in the grievance. I'm stuck in the idea that something needed to change. And if it doesn't change, and think about this, if it's in the past and it already happened, and based on our distinctions, which are, I need something to change for me to be happy, the past cannot change in the reality of what occurred. And so I'm stuck if that's what needs to change for me to be happy, I'm shit out of luck, folks. Like, there's nothing I can do. If I have to have my father pay better attention to me as a child for me to feel okay today, that can't change. My dad isn't going to change his behavior in the past so that I can feel better today. So I got to figure out a different strategy to deal with that. And then trust. It's very hard to trust someone that you're engaged in a grievance with. And there's a whole issue here about trusting self. We'll get into that. So then we put these two lists up. And I remember I said that first list didn't look so bad, payoffs and grievances. The payoff side didn't look too bad. But when you put it up against the costs of holding on to our grievances, this is where we get back to what's behind me. You can't see it right now. Happy versus right. On the left is being right. That's the ego's version of being right. And that's what you get for being right. But the cost is essentially happiness. When you get to blame someone else and blame a situation and blame a thing for what's going on for you, you're giving up happiness. You're choosing to be right rather than being happy. I'll take that off. I'll end the screen share. So any thoughts about that so far? We're going to dig in a little deeper, but the idea here is Course in Miracles term, which is strengthening one's motivation for change. And so when you look at that list of the payoffs and the cost, the idea is to hopefully motivate you to give up your grievances or examine them so you can let them go. Because I want to go back to that idea. It's really important that we don't just decide to dismiss the grievance. We really need to look at it as Neville sort of mentioned, I need to look at me. I need to understand what's going on for me. Again, I want to stop blaming the other person or the other situation, but I still need to figure out what's going on with me around this. And of course, we would always point to the fact that there's a false belief that's going on. Once I look at myself, I start to see there's a false belief that's occurring here. So my dad didn't pay attention to me and I bought into the idea that I'm not important. And today I can see how I've lived that life. I've lived the life of a not important person. Okay. And so now what we want to start to do is we go to conscious and subconscious. Okay, we go to conscious and subconscious. And consciously, I'm thinking dad was wrong. And that's what I've been thinking all along. While subconsciously, that not important belief, I am not important, I'm not important, I, has been existing in my subconscious mind. And as long as I hold dad responsible, I'm never going to get over this. So once I start to mirror what's going on, look at myself and recognize I have an I'm not important belief, then I decide, is that true? Is that why dad was doing what he was doing? Is it because I was not important, or was it because stuff was going on for dad? I mean, 99.99999% of the time, it's because stuff was going on for dad. It's not about you being not important. Okay. And so once you start to think about those ideas, then you start to examine and get conscious of, well, how have I lived this belief out? And let me just look at let me bring that into my consciousness. How have I lived that out? And do I want to keep doing that? Because by holding on to this, one of the reasons I want to hold on to this false belief is so that I can continue to blame dad. But once I realize that blaming dad isn't helping me, then I start to get conscious of that false belief and I can let it go. So that's a lot of information, you guys. So I want to stop and pause and just make sure you guys are on board with what I'm saying and see if you have any questions. We're good? Okay. I'm going to keep going. Then we start to get to the happiness. Once I start to examine, one of the ways we get to happiness is by examining my process without judgment. So in my scenario with dad, I start to look at my process of identifying myself as not important, and I can start to see that idea was engendered in me with my relationship with my dad. That's fine to identify that, and I understand that that's one of the places that belief was engendered for me in my mind, and one of the places that it was reinforced. But what I want to do is start to examine, how have I lived that out, and is it really true? Is it true that I'm not important? And one of the questions I like to ask about this is, was anyone born not important? And so No one's born not important, so therefore it's a learned belief, it's a learned idea. So if I've been living my life and it's something that I learned, I can unlearn it. And again, if I was born, I'm not important, like that was like somehow ingrained in my cellular reality, there's not much I could do about it. But once I start to understand that it's a learned belief, then I can unlearn it. And so how do I unlearn a false belief? I bring the false belief up into my conscious mind and I start to examine the reality or not reality of it. And again, one of the ways I understand that it's not real is I realize it's just a learned belief. And that can be unlearned. So any false belief I have, I can unlearn it. Okay? So this is sort of the process of becoming happy rather than being right. And remember, right is about defending against I'm not important. And I get very defensive and interested in making sure the other person isn't saying these things to me that push this button, all those kind of things. But once I start to examine the button, instead of trying to keep people from pushing my button, I instead take the time to examine what is the button about for me, and can I reduce the size of my own button? And that's when I start to get more happiness and less need to be right. So I'm going to say that again. Being right is about defending against people pushing my buttons. I try and keep people from pushing my buttons so that I don't feel this I'm not important belief and the pain and depression that I have around it with their comments and the way they treat me. So again, the ability to handle all these events, people, and things outside of you is very limited. It's almost impossible to manage all those things outside of you so that they don't push the button. So instead, we start to make the button conscious, look at the process of the button, understand it, examine it in the light, okay? Happiness and lightness are associated, okay? So in the light of my conscious mind, I start to examine the reality of this button. And by making it conscious rather than subconscious, I'm automatically reducing the size of the button. I can say to myself, God, I wasn't born unimportant, so that's just not true about me. It's something that I learned, and I can unlearn that about myself, okay? And I keep repeating those kind of things because they're really important concepts to hold in your mind. And again, this idea of being happy is sort of the opposite of the rightness idea, right? Here I'm defending myself against all those things outside of me that are upsetting me. Here, I'm starting to examine my own process so that I can learn to be happy. And learning to be happy means I'm reducing my I'm not important, I false belief. I'm reducing the number of that false belief in my mind. So maybe it was an 8, and if I reduce it to a 4, that, folks, is an exponential change in your life. If you can bring that false belief from an 8 to a 4, your life would change so dramatically you can't imagine. Okay, so that, and one of the ways we reduce this, remember, it remains an 8 because it's in my subconscious mind. It's in my subconscious. I am not consciously aware that it's even happening or how I'm reinforcing it with this defensive posture that I maintain. I'm maintaining a defensive posture, and the defensive posture is growing this false belief for me. I have no idea that's happening because it's subconscious. Once it becomes conscious, that number starts to reduce, okay? But again, as long as it's subconscious, the number is going to stay whatever it is for as long as it is, because it's, again, subconscious. I can't have an effect on something that I'm not aware of. So when that false belief is in my subconscious mind, there's nothing I can do about it. All right. So questions, comments, any stories you're wondering, like, how does this apply to this, that, or the other thing? Anything confusing about what I'm explaining? You guys are on board with this. Neville, can you sort of see this with Medea?
Yeah, I'm still digesting it, but yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, again, there's stuff that even things that we did that we were holding ourselves accountable for in the past, and we're holding on to grievances with ourselves. So we've been talking a lot about Dad, we've been talking about a lot of other people, but there's all the things that we've done in the past. We're holding on to a grievance for ourselves. So yeah. So one of the words that we can talk about in this process, I'm gonna clear a little space here. one of the terms that we can talk about is forgiveness. And this is, I'm putting it on the right side of the board because it's closely associated with happiness. And again, when I have a grievance, I'm holding a grievance against myself for something I did wrong, something I did in quote wrong, then I'm gonna be over on this side of the board, needing to defend myself. I'm not going to be happy. By forgiving myself for my mistake. So what are some of the ideas we use to forgive ourselves for our mistakes? What's one of the stories we tell that's an idea about how to forgive ourselves for our mistakes?
Well, I guess the only thing,
Go ahead.
well, that we're doing the best we could at that moment.
Yeah, best we could.
I mean,
The other version of that is the idea that we could not have done it any differently.
yeah,
Based on what was going on, couldn't have done it differently. So based on everything that you were experiencing at that particular moment in your life, no matter what the choice was, you couldn't have done it any differently. And what I mean is, if I have an I'm not important belief, it's an 8 in my mind, and I have no idea that that belief even exists in my mind. And I look back on the way I behaved 5 years ago when I was completely unconsciously aware of this process in my mind. Can I really hold myself guilty for something that was going on for me that I was unaware of? The example I give is, if a coach gives a quarterback a new play, in the middle of a game, they give them a new play, they've never practiced the play before, they go out and screw up the play. Can they really hold themselves guilty? No, they say to themselves, I never practiced the play, I've never seen it before, no wonder it didn't work well, I had no idea how to do that. The same thing goes for whatever you did when your I'm not good enough or I'm not important belief was an 8. You couldn't have done it any differently because that's the unawareness that was going on. Fair? So this is one of the ways that we begin to forgive ourselves for past indiscretions. And we can also forgive others with the same technology. In other words, like we can start to forgive Dad, earnestly forgive Dad for the way he showed up because he had an not important belief that was an 8. That's why he was doing what he was doing. It had nothing to do with me. Does that make sense? I don't know if that helps people undo anything for themselves.
Yeah, I find this whole thing kind of timely and amusing in a way, because I forgot about it, but I have this long-standing grievance with my children at Christmas time, because none of my children have ever, they ask me what I want for Christmas, I tell them, and they've never bought me what I told them I wanted.
Okay.
I mean, it's just predictable.
Yeah.
And damn if I didn't fall sucker to it again this year, because, I was like, okay, this is the year that, I told my son and his girlfriend who are living in my house, I only want one thing for Christmas. I want a dog gate to keep my Great Danes out of the living room,
Yeah.
because I got one that's broke set up. And I, it's like, this is all I want for Christmas is a dog gate. And my other son asked me what I wanted. I told him something else. And neither one of them got me what I wanted. And this is like, they have never in my entire life ever gotten me what I wanted to ask for Christmas.
This is like Charlie Brown with Lucy and the football.
It is. It really is. I was like, okay, this is the year that they will actually, I made it so simple that they can't not get me what I asked for Christmas.
Yeah.
So
So
get me.
So so based on what we're talking about, John, what's your understanding about why that's going on?
Well, that's a great thing, because I know what the cause is. I mean, I go back when I was a child, I had that unloved, unlovable. My parents never got me what I wanted for Christmas. Christmas always sucked. Christmas was always yelling and fighting, and there were promises of presents, but not presents under the tree and shit. So I understand why it hooks me from my past when it happens, but why it's still going on, I have no effing clue. So you can help me with that one because my children are all rational thinking human beings and they ask me what I want, I tell them, and then they don't get it.
Yeah, so this is gonna seem strange, but whatever the false belief is that was driving, that you sort of bought into when your parents didn't get you what you want, is still driving the same experience today. And so I'm not sure what the logistics of it are. But one of the things that can happen is, you know, in my story about dad being, you know, not paying attention to me and I have an I'm not important belief. The funny thing is that I will recreate experiences, as long as it's a subconscious false belief for me, I will recreate all kinds of experiences that reinforce that. And they'll almost seem like magic. Like this situation with your kids sounds like almost like a magic trick. Like, how are they possibly still doing this? You know, and how could it possibly be related to what's going on with my parents? I'm telling you, in some way, shape, or form, it is you're recreating it. So do you have any idea what the false belief is?
Well, the false belief is basically unlovable, unworthy.
Okay.
That I, as a child, feeling unloved and unlovable.
Yeah. So the trick for you is to decide, is that how I feel when my kids still do this? Like, is that the belief that pops up for me? And so what we practice for next year is to like go into the Christmas season knowing this is the buttons that get pushed for me around this time of year because of what happens every year. The same thing happens every year. And you know what? I'm going to let go of that because I'm not unworthy and I'm not unlovable. I'm a worthy, lovable person. And so whatever happens, it happens. And it doesn't mean that I'm unworthy or unlovable. Their behavior doesn't dictate who I am. So if you can be consciously aware of that, I can't guarantee it, but probably the events around you will start to shift in that respect. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah. So, and again, for John, you know, whatever the false belief is, if I can make it a conscious process and consciously choose against it, in other words, and when I say consciously choose against it, I can identify, this has been my experience. Every time I go to my mother's house and she talks to me, I feel like I'm not worthy because of the stuff she says to me. So now I've taken out of the matrix, and the next time I see my mom, I'm going to know it's really not what she's saying. It's the false belief that I'm carrying around in my mind, and that's the button that's getting pushed when she says that. And I don't have to allow that to happen. I can say to myself, Mom is saying that, she's projecting her stuff onto me. And so that's the other piece for your kids is, unfortunately or fortunately, as parents, we share our false belief with our kids. So your kids might be reflecting this false belief as well with their behavior.
So next year, because it was funny, I knew it would happen this year because it happens every year. And I was kind of like, okay, I'm not going to get annoyed with this, but sure as shit I did.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is that I suppose next year when my kids ask me what I want, do I tell them, well, I'm only going to tell you if you actually get it because every year you ask me and
No,
then you never get it? Or
Yeah, no, I wouldn't change your behavior at all. I would do the same things you've always done. The key is between now and next year, for the next 360 days or so, for you to work on this false belief. So,
Sure.
so I want you to start to look at how does unlovable and unworthy show up in my life, and start to keep a journal. I don't know if you're a journaler, but start to keep track of how often, how does this show up? Where else does this button get pushed for me? Like what other events, what other people, what other experiences for me push this button? And so and what happens when you're doing that is you're becoming more and more conscious, more and more conscious, more and more conscious of that false belief. And then you can choose against it more and more often. Marty, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, John. Next year, get them a dog gate for Christmas.
What?
Give your kids a dog gate
Okay.
for Christmas.
Okay.
Get them a dog gate for Christmas. Yeah, that's good.
And then you can exchange gifts.
Yes.
But again, so, and John's example is a great one in the sense that he's got the false belief. These people are behaving in ways that would sort of reinforce that idea if you bought into it. And it's hard to recognize that he's actually creating those experiences. And one of the ways he's creating it probably is he shared some of that unlovable and unworthy belief with his kids, and they're reflecting that back to him in some way, shape, or form. So John's job is to become more aware, have a much greater awareness of that false belief for himself over this next year. And then I would imagine things will change. Can't guarantee it, but I would imagine things will change for you. Anyone else?
Hey,
Go ahead, John. Anybody else have questions or comments or concerns? I'm going to stop the recording.